Thanks for coming back to another episode of Pitch It, a fintech conversation amongst founders, investors, and friends. I'm your host, Todd Anderson, Chief Content Officer at FinTech Nexus. And what we do is we take a peek behind the curtain. What motivates someone to start a company? How do investors make the right bet? What do accelerators do during and help enabling the process of growing your company? How do banks think of founders? Not to mention, we try to have some fun, and what you'll see is we'll also do some special episodes. We have some new features coming. So stick with us, and you'll get all you'll need to know about the fintech startup landscape. Pitch It is really a part of a larger podcast network here at FinTech Nexus. You can go to my colleague Peter, our co-founder and chairman, for FinTech One-on-One. You can subscribe to his feed, or we have our newest podcast by one of our writers, Isabel Castro, the FinTech Coffee Break. For everything produced by FinTech Nexus, you can check out FinTech Nexus Podcast, which is really our content fire hose. All shows, webinar replays, even in-person event content, not to mention our weekly news show. As always, we hope that you rate the show and write a review. I try to really take listener feedback seriously, and as it helps make the show better. You can also follow the podcast and all of our podcasts on the feed of your choice, whether it be Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen, or come directly to news.fintechnexus.com. Now, let's get on with the show. On today's episode, I was joined by Craig McLaughlin, co-founder and CEO of Finalytics. Finalytics is the first customer-centric data platform designed to help community banks and credit unions translate high-touch service onto the digital channel. I find the community bank and credit union markets fascinating, as they don't have the luxury of, throwing money at problems or billions of dollars, at technical issues like JP Morgan and Bank of America and Citi. They have to be a lot more strategic. What do we need and how does it solve our technical needs? Craig and I talked about the community bank and credit union market, how that differs from super regionals and large banks, the current economic conditions for both fintechs and these smaller FIs. Can digital touch equal human touch when it comes to this high-touch environment? And I think that's a huge point that we focused a lot of time on is, do you lose anything when you go digital? Raising capital, the San Francisco 49ers, and a little bit about my Buffalo Bills, and much, much more. Before we get to the episode, just a reminder, as always, we have a lot of great offerings here at FinTech Nexus. You can sponsor an episode of the pod. You can sponsor a webinar. You can also sponsor and attend one of our large-scale in-person events as well. If you want to talk about that, or if you want to possibly come on the show, feel free to reach out to me anytime. It's just Todd, T-O-D-D, at fintechnexus.com. Now, without further ado, my conversation with Craig McLaughlin, co-founder and CEO of Finalytics. I hope you all enjoy the show. Hey, Craig, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate you having me here. Thank you.
Of course. So I'd like to kick off, tell the audience a little bit about yourself. But obviously before starting your current venture, kind of what's your road been to this point?
So for a long time, I ran a digital consultancy that worked with all kinds of companies. We're based here in Silicon Valley, doing digital strategy and user experience. And my background originally was focused on was an engineer. I was an engineer long enough to realize that there were dramatically better engineers out there in the world than me, and I should work with them instead of trying to do the code myself. And that's what I did.
So what brought you to the current venture, Finalytics, kind of what brought you to the point of wanting to become a founder and entrepreneur as well? Because, there's various motivations when I do these conversations of kind of why people want to start a company, whether it's they found a problem or they were kind of always on that path and it was just a matter of time of when they got there? Kind of where do you fall in that category?
It's funny you asked the question. So I always wanted to found and run a company. That's always kind of what I was most interested in. And when I wasn't doing that, I wanted to go and solve interesting problems um, for companies. And one of my first positions was working for Sony in research and development. And so it was looking at new technologies and ideating on how those technologies could be applied inside of Sony as a whole. But what I was really longing for at the end of that period of time was a real world application of those solutions. And so what's exciting was how could you bring together digital solutions that integrated data to be able to then drive better outcomes. And so for me, the more work that we did consulting with financial services companies, the more interesting that problem kind of became, because financial services is kind of unique in terms of as it relates to digital, because you really have all of the means of connection with the consumer at your disposal in terms of influencing that outcome. And it's a very personal relationship, right? The relationship somebody has with their money isn't really between oftentimes the customer and the institution. It's really between the customer and their money. And so it's an intimate relationship. It's a personal relationship. And so finding ways to make that experience more relevant and more meaningful for customers is super interesting. Also, when you consider what incumbent financial services organizations are trying to do in terms of kind of manifesting their offline value proposition into the digital channel, the ability to kind of maintain that offline value prop of high touch, high service really requires the use of data in smart ways on an individual basis. And so there's so much focus that can be put in there that it really can't be done so much manually. You have to find ways to be able to do that at scale. And so I think that was kind of, for us, that was the big epiphany moment for Finalytics was, hey, we know every incumbent financial services organization is going to need to get this right. Because it's kind of it's on the roadmap to their destiny. And so then there's some analysis around, well, how might they solve that? Is that something that's solved inside of an existing solution? And when you look at those tool sets, we didn't see them as being as viable because they were really built to solve other things. And if you wanted to do this right, you really had to do it kind of on a sole focus basis.
As we get a little bit further into exactly who you guys are serving and the various products that you have, is the name as obvious as it looks, Finalytics?
Yeah, I got to tell you, honestly, it was the easiest decision, Todd. I mean, it was like we knew we wanted to focus on financial services and hence the Fin, and we knew it was going to be related to data analytics and hence the analytics. And then finally, we knew we were going to use machine learning and AI and all that combined with then the domain was also available. So that made the name pretty easy to be able to go and get trademarked.
So tell us a little bit more about exactly about who's the ultimate target, and what are the various products that you guys have?
So the target is in the United States, there's about 10,000 both community financial institutions and credit unions. And that includes the biggest ones like, the Chases and the B of A's and the cities. But they're really the kind of the not the lion's share, right? They're a tiny fraction. What's interesting is that they control the vast majority of the assets, and so the top 10 financial institutions control 90+% of the total invested assets in all financial institutions in the United States. But what that does is it opens up the door to this opportunity for kind of a long tail, right? So all these institutions that also need to deliver great digital experiences at a smaller scale. And so, anywhere from the super regionals at the couple $100 billion all the way down to the small, couple $100 million small credit unions is kind of the total addressable market that we're focused on.
When doing research on this, obviously I was on your website and going through your LinkedIn and whatnot, and on the website you show the integrations that you guys have, and I noticed, I'm pretty sure if, I remember correctly, all of them are basically cloud-based solutions.
Yeah.
You know, how much does moving to a cloud-based technology or technologies, how different is that for traditional financial institutions? And B, how much more potential can there be if they go in this direction versus what I assume a lot of, especially the older, maybe smaller institutions are still operating on, which is not cloud-based technologies?
You're right. And so, I think it's kind of a matter of time. And I think that's part of why we architected our platform in the way that we did, is that when you look at what the mega banks are doing, 8 years ago, they would look at the cloud solutions with concern around security and a whole myriad of other factors. But fast forward to today, and they don't look at it that way anymore. They've really evolved. And I think the same thing was true if you think 20 years ago of Salesforce automation platforms or tool sets. They all used to be on-prem, and there's great quotes from the CEO of GE saying he'd never let his data be off-prem. That would be a big risk. But I think in today's world, the idea that you're going to buy hardware, hire teams to be able to manage them when they could be delivered at such a more cost-effective scale via these cloud platforms, it's really kind of it's inevitable. I think we're all going to end up there. And so I think it takes a little bit. It's taking a little bit of time, but I think it's starting to turn a little bit, particularly with community financial institutions. It's taking them some time, but they're going to turn the corner on that eventually. It's going to be, everyone will do it eventually.
How much? What would you estimate today in terms of let's focus more on the smaller side, not obviously the Chases of the world. If you go to maybe the regional and the smaller community banks and credit unions, are half of them on the cloud-based, 25% today? Where do you think it is today?
I would say it's a little bit isolated, and I think that's one of the challenges of the category, is that it's really you can have really siloed divisions inside of financial services institutions that have some autonomy, and they're able to go and buy their own software. But I would say you're probably in the 25%, and I think it depends on what you're describing, right? There's one-off solutions like tool sets for ticketing, for example, that you'd pretty easily be able to get approved to run offsite. But then if it's something that's a little bit more mainstream, it requires more scrutiny from InfoSec. And so I think that takes a little bit more time. And so, but my guess is probably around a quarter.
What would you say in talking to a lot of these institutions, are some of the common mistakes that these firms are still making today when it comes to either digital based technologies or some of the stuff that you guys focus on, which is a lot of the data, and the focus on analytics, and are banks still making some common mistakes that you guys are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary is that they're just not using the data that they have. And I think that's when you think about the kind of three types of institutions that are in this category. You've got the megas, and you've got then the fintechs, then you've got other, right, this community banking orientation, whether that's a super regional, a credit union, or average sized community financial institution. the fintechs are really great at using data. It's their DNA, right? So they
Yeah.
every step they can take towards building an experience that is better optimized to drive better conversion, they're going to take, because their life depends on it, right? They have to get those things right. And the megas have so much money, right? They can spend and innovate kind of in ways that kind of are beyond what anybody else could really kind of ante up to be able to do.
Yeah.
And then in the community financial services kind of segment, I think their challenge is making the right choices and bringing the right partners in order to be able to get that right. So I think they know they have to partner. There perhaps is a speed to partnering question around how quickly they're going to do that, what problems they're going to solve. But I think they're all going to have to come around as it relates to that.
You also reference on your website about, um, you know, the smaller based institutions, the credit unions, community banks. What they're known for is that high touch.
Yeah.
It's different from the large banks who have 50, 60 million customers. It's hard to have high touch with all those many millions of customers. But can you get the same level of high touch with digital? And do these institutions need to get to that same level with digital, or am I, thinking of this in the wrong context when it comes to high touch and what they've kind of made their name on?
No, I don't think you're thinking about it incorrectly. I mean, Todd, I think you nailed like the opportunity that our clients are seeing. And so, I'll take a step back and then answer your question around the use of data. Is the reason why we built Finalytics is that we worked with credit union and bank leadership teams long enough to determine how to build a great digital experience for them. And that was a lot of kind of strategic work where we bring in each of their individual departmental executives and ask about what their offline goals and objectives are, with the goal of generating kind of this comprehensive, coordinated digital strategy that the organization could truly buy into, that represented all the department's needs, right? And then we also would go out and talk to customers and say, well, hey, we're building a strategy. We want to make sure that we understand why people like you bank here. Can you talk to us about what that is? We do interviews. And what we find is the customers would all tell stories about high touch services. They'd say, I had a problem and I went into a branch and they did this great thing for me. That was a special circumstance. They understood me a little bit better. They gave me some great advice. And those were the reasons why I bank with this institution. And it was pretty consistent. It was, whether you were having that interview in Jacksonville, Florida, or in upstate New York, or in Orange County, it was pretty much the same answer. The reason why people bank with community FIs is because of that high touch experience. And when you talk to the executives and you say, well, what do you stand for? What are you about? What's the brand? Why do people bank here? They would say the same thing. They all said, well, people bank with us because we offer this really great high touch service. And they also would tell these stories about how they would go above and beyond. So now when you say, all right, the world's changed, all these services now need to be delivered digitally. Well, how are you going to take that offline value proposition of high touch service and manifest it into the digital channel? There's really only, there's only a few ways of being able to do that. And it's at those touch points, right? So what you have at your disposal to inform this high touch and personalized experience digitally is data, right? And so that's where data on user behavior, data on transactions, whatever data you have that you can act on, if you can feed that into AI and machine learning to then generate associations and connections and understand similar behavior, and just like on Amazon, right? So people that were looking for this also bought this other thing. But doing that at another level with regards to actual transaction data inside of a customer's account, um, is really the keys to the kingdom to getting that right. Right? It's offering those insights and saying, hey, we noticed this thing about you. In fact, you might be interested in this, and those are those kinds of moments in truth that you can deliver digitally. That if you're not doing that, you're kind of delivering a homogeneous experience to every visitor.
In hearing you talk about that, it sounds like, there's a bit of a misnomer that if there's technology involved, it can't be as high touch, or it can't be as close as, say, if it was that interaction between me and you individually. But if you have the right information, the right data, and offer a service that solves their problems, that ultimately it can equal that in-person experience, as long as you're speaking to that person as Craig versus a group of people, or an offer that might go to hundreds of thousands of people. It's
Yeah,
about you
segment.
and your experience.
Yeah, we call it a segment of one, so it's informed by you and your data. In fact, I actually think if you think of what a branch person can effectively do in a 2.5 minute conversation, it's really hard for them to be able to beat the power of data and AI in terms of understanding what that user is interested in. And if you fed in enough of the available data points, I think it can actually be better and offer an even better experience to the consumer, and really drive that kind of a high touch affinity relationship.
We're kind of in this interesting time right now when it comes to the smaller in financial institution, as well as fintechs. So fintechs have kind of made these strides, but at the same time, the last year you saw depressed valuations. You're getting lots of layoffs, and it felt like we were going towards a period of fintechs were really going to encroach upon these community-based and credit union institutions. But now it feels like that's kind of been stopped a little bit by the market conditions. When you're talking to these institutions, do you get a sense of they're worried about fintechs? The market has changed? Like, what's the dynamic that kind of fintech has, changed over the years? And do they see fintechs as a threat, a partner, an enabler? Kind of how do they view the fintech market right now?
I think it's kind of an ebb and flow. I would say it's a cycle over time. Is I think very early on at the beginning of these fintechs, the incumbents looked at fintechs as being kind of a novelty, and they weren't as threatened because they could look and say, "What's a really small amount of assets maybe we're seeing leave us and go somewhere else." And I think as that number grew, I think that threat became a little bit more real, and they got a little bit more concerned. And then when they looked in the mirror and said, well, what do we need to do differently to remain relevant to the customers we already have, and win the right new ones? They started to look at kind of the basics, and they said, well, clearly we need to look at a new online banking platform, or a new core, or whatever those tool sets are that they would then go and deploy. But I think it's gone beyond that now, where they're realizing that the opportunity is a little bit deeper than that, and it's how do you use digital to be able to not just maintain what you have, but then also to go and grow to that next generation of customers. And so I think that with that, there's a lot of learning going on. I don't see so much. I mean, I wouldn't say that, given, I don't think the investment environment as it relates to fintechs is really affecting so much their perception inside of incumbents around their relative threat. I think it's just it's another service, right? And so I think that the service remains competitive, whether or not their valuation is half of what it was last year.
You think there could be an opportunity for some of these firms to maybe buy or purchase parts of fintechs on the cheap, that can maybe help them leap forward a little bit in an environment that might allow them to, versus maybe a year or two from now when there might be a bounce back in fintech and that opportunity just doesn't present as maybe as advantageous as it would today?
Yeah, I definitely think that's an option. I think it does come down to the kind of strategy of the institution. I don't know how. I couldn't speak to, in my experience, that there's a huge amount of appetite for that, given the macroeconomic environment that the incumbents are facing on their own, right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's
that's true.
enough headwinds there that are not kind of venture related, where they're trying to make sure that they've batten down the hatches and they're ready to get through a tough environment. They're banks; they know how to manage risk, right? So they're really good at trying to address risk. And so I'm not saying, I mean, I think they're learning lessons and they're saying, huh, that's interesting. We might want to do that. I think when I think back to the times where banks were more acquisitive in that capacity, it tended to be for particular lines of business they didn't have, whether that was student lending or something like that, that they were going to go after. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't anticipate a ton of M&A from the incumbents of fintechs. I think and if anything, I'd imagine there would be a lot of learning from the vanguards, right? Seeing what are they doing well, what are they doing poorly, how might that relate to our business? And I think increasingly the incumbents will develop competencies in terms of how to get digital right, even though it's slow. I mean, you imagine it's probably 5 years behind what the fintechs are doing, but I think as fintechs innovate, it'll trickle down.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned about Finalytics since you guys have launched, or one of the biggest lessons?
I think it's probably this. It takes more time, I think, than you anticipate to do certain things. So it's a little bit. It can be challenging to get a company launched in this category. I think it just takes time. It takes more time than I would have guessed. It would be my lesson learned. Is I would just expect that maybe if you're looking and you're thinking this is something that can be built in a year, maybe it's going to take 2 years. That kind of analysis, and plan for that, and make sure you're adequately resourced to be able to navigate that window.
Do you have a biggest regret or a regret along the way?
No, I don't. I mean, that's not true. So I don't have. I would say that in Finalytics, I don't really have that, but in previous companies, I think the biggest lesson learned is that you live and die on culture. They say, strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think that's totally true. Your team, you're only as good as your team, and if you focus on hiring the brilliant jerk, the the very best guy you can find to do a job, and you kind of ignore maybe some red flags on the way that they work with others, and you're willing to take a little bit of friction in exchange for a higher caliber candidate. I think you lose. I think by risking that, you lose a lot. In my experience, it all comes down to a team that can come together and work well together. And so it's about communication. It's about taking care of your people. It's about being direct. It's about creating a framework where everybody can kind of thrive and shine. And I think that's the most important. I would say it's funny in terms of. And I always laugh when you asked the question originally, Todd, about regrets, and I never understand people that say they have no regrets, because I just, it doesn't make sense, doesn't equate to
Yeah.
me. But certainly, I think that, like, as a category of an opportunity to do something different, I think that there's a huge opportunity to be able to get that right, and really focus on your people, build on team building, bringing people together with a common cause, and making sure it's a rewarding environment for everybody.
Best or one of the best pieces of advice that you've received thus far?
I think I think I would go back to the comment around, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's consistently the lesson learned there is it's really about it's about team.
Speaking of team, tell us a little bit more about the team around you. How big is the team today? What does the team look like, in terms of types of roles, and what's the split, engineering and strategy and sales, kind of what does everyone look like around you, and how big is the team today?
Yeah, so our team is probably 20 to 30 people at this point, so still relatively small. And the nice thing about COVID is that while we're here physically in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're now able to recruit people from all around the country, all around the world. So we've got people in New Orleans and Seattle and New Jersey, Minnesota, Ukraine, Mexico, Chile. I mean, just kind of all across the board, and we're able to get the right people into a group. Bringing everybody together into regular Scrum sessions has proven to be uh, the really effective at organizing everybody. Whether that's just a quick stand up meeting daily, or longer kind of planning sessions throughout the week. I think that's been key. And I would say we're relatively small in sales and marketing, but we've got some good team members that are on contract that are just killer of what they do. And the lion's share of where we're focusing on is making sure every client that we work with is super successful from day one, and they're glowing references, and then really investing in data and AI.
Have you guys raised outside capital from investors? And if you have, kind of what has that process looked like, and what you learn during that investment kind of round or process?
So we looked at it. We kind of went down that road, and what we ultimately ended up choosing to do is to be really selective. And so it was clear there were a few organizations that we thought would bring more than money, and they would be able to help us in key ways. And we thought, when we considered the most critical success factors in our journey, where did we think we would need the most help? And then we thought, well, these people are really interesting. If they would participate with us, then that would probably, be a force multiplier. And ultimately, we ended up to do was we just decided that it would be better to focus on just building the product at this point and not going down that other road. Not that we're never say never, but at this
Mhm.
point, we're really focused on just achieving the goals we have laid out in front of us. So we're holding back on that for now.
Do you think sometimes founders make a mistake in that they view it as too much of a money transaction versus what you kind of referenced there, which was, if we're going to find the right partner, it needs to be a holistic, hey, they can help us with this, or they can help us be an additive part of the team or an advisor to this aspect of our business, versus here's a check. Now tell me in 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months how you're going to meet goal one, goal two, goal three, so we can worry about checks two, three, four, and five down the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think on that in that regard, I think there's probably a yin and the yang to both. I mean, I think that there's advantages to somebody that is driving you towards a financial outcome that everybody is focused on trying to achieve. Um, there's disadvantages though when that becomes the only objective and perhaps begins to um, to take over other goals and objectives. And so the guys I talk to that are more in the kind of the VC space, some would say, "Hey, boy, isn't it great that you're able to go through and do it this way?" And others would say, "But aren't you going to need more resources in order to make that happen?" And it's I think it's hard to answer that question. Certainly, from a customer perspective, I think customers get a lot more value from the approach that we're taking, which is, we live or die based on their satisfaction, right? So we have to everybody on the team from the top down has to be available anytime to make sure that the clients are getting exactly what they need, which is our primary focus.
We have just a few minutes left. One final question before we get to some fun questions to end. We'll have a lot of other founders that listen to the show. If you had one piece of advice to offer them, other than obviously the culture one, what would it be?
I read a great quote. I forget who said it, but somebody talked about EQ and how critical that was in the journey. I think you really have to make sure that as a startup, you represent the kind of cornerstone of the organization, and your DNA should leave an imprint on how everyone else in the organization operates. And so, as a result, making sure that you're showing up as your best self is crucial. It's critical, right? If there's any cracks in the founding team or any cracks outside of that, they get magnified really fast. And so you've got to make sure you show up strong and you've got your head on right. I think if that's one bit of advice, I'd give is really be focused.
Few final fun questions. Do you have a favorite book or the last book that you read?
So right now I'm reading this book, The End of the World is Just Beginning by Peter Dehan. It's an analysis of deglobalization and the associated journey of each country it would face in the context of that transition, and specifically about how the United States compares against China in that journey, and what that means to the superpowers of the world, potentially 10, 20, 100 years from now. It's super, super fascinating. It's pretty remarkable. This guy is really impressive analysis.
You mentioned obviously, coming focused. Is there an activity, a sport, meditation? What do you do to unwind, step away, and ensure that you come as your best self?
I always put on my list the to-dos is the Headspace app, right? To go and meditate, but I never am able to nail that. I pretty consistently have used running as the best outlet, right? So the periods of time where I'm religious and consistent and regular about running 5 miles, 3 times a week, that seems to be the kind of the cornerstone for me.
Do you have, other than running, a favorite sport or sport teams that you root for?
So right now we're all pretty huge 49ers fans here in the Bay Area, given Purdy and our progress in the playoffs. So we're excited about that. That's our big point of enthusiasm at this point. Looking forward to Saturday.
Oh, maybe my Bills will meet your 49ers in the Super Bowl. So we'll see.
I think there's a good chance.
A fairly good chance, as long as
Yeah.
Josh Allen doesn't throw it to the other team still. Favorite vacation spot?
So the Big Island of Hawaii, there's a spot right in between, right when you fly into Kona, about 10 minutes away. On the one side, there's the Kona Village Hotel where Steve Jobs used to go and stay. On the other side, there's a development where that Michael Dell developed. So it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition between those two spots. But literally, it's just the most beautiful location. So I really, we have friends that have a place there. We'd love to take advantage of it, and it's absolutely gorgeous.
And then final question is biggest inspiration in life. What inspires you?
I'm always such a huge fan. Like, even we were talking about the Bills and 49ers. Like, I'm a huge fan of the underdog. I love to see a Purdy come in who's unproven, young, and he just goes for it and aligns the team together around a common goal. So I love to see the underdog pull it off. It doesn't mean that I'm disappointed to see the Buccaneers' performance this past week, but I love to see the underdog win.
Well, Craig, I appreciate you taking out a few minutes to chat with me. If someone wanted to reach out, find you, or find Finalytics, how would they do that?
It's easier for me, just email me at Craig@Finalytics.ai. And if you'd like to learn more about our platform, go to our website. We've connected it all up, via Calendly to be able to schedule demos and book a demo. I'd be happy to jump on and walk you through how we built it and how it might be able to help you.
All right, sounds good. Thanks so much, Craig. Appreciate the time and continued success to you and the team.
Thank you very much, Todd. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yep, thank you.